On this episode of DM Gives Inspiration, we are going to discuss running your first city. We've touched on cities a little in the past, and I've basically regarded them as advanced DMing. What we're going to do today is break down the essentials of running a city and how you can do it in the easiest way possible. This is assuming you want to add a city into your campaign. If you want to have a urban campaign where the city is the entire deal, that's a very different thing than what we're going to be discussing today. And a city is no different mechanically than walking through a dungeon or strolling through a forest, except for it is full of people. People and constant theming to remind players that they are in a city environment. At its very core, a city needs to be as detailed as you need it to be to complete the quest or the story that you're telling. Let's take, for example, the 1984 movie Ghostbusters. Peter Venkman, Ray Stantz, and Egon Spengler are scientists, but basically adventurers from the local university who head to a dungeon, in this case the New York Public Library. Above this dungeon is a small town, and they interview the locals, trying to figure out what sort of monster might lay beneath. After they encounter the high-level ghost there in the catacombs, they flee, but realize that if they level up, they may be able to come back with better equipment and better skills to destroy or capture that particular monster. They go about building their reputation. And this is where a quest giver, Dana Barrett, a noble around Central Park, contacts them about a strange monster she met in her refrigerator. This starts the adventurers down their main quest, involving ancient gods and the architecture and layout of the city itself. But along the way, they are hired at their darkest moment, at their lowest low, to run a dungeon. The Cedric Hotel has a monster inside that needs removing. Upon arrival, they talk to the hotel manager, and they are seen and reacted to by the many passers-by in the hotel. Once actually on the dungeon floor, they encounter a maid and a steward. Now we know that the firehouse, or you could call it the tavern, is in one location. We know that Dana Barrett's apartment is in another location, and we know that we got in a vehicle to drive to the Sedgwick Hotel. The exact layout of the city doesn't matter here, but we have a sense of space, and because the character of New York is so strong, that's some cockroach, we know we're in a city the entire time. After defeating this high-profile dungeon, their reputation explodes. They're getting tons of work, they have lots of money, but they also attract the attention of one Walter Peck, an environmental protection agency inspector, but we could call it a guild representative. And the guild representative doesn't like how they're doing things. And to avoid running through the whole plot of Ghostbusters, this snowballs into them meeting the mayor and saving the city from an ancient god, Gozer the Gozerian. In order to have a city in your game, you do not need to map out every street and every building. What you need is functional locations that encompass the character and tone of that city. And the biggest difference between the hallways of a hotel and a monster-infested, ancient, far-out dungeon is reputation and reaction. People are watching these heroes. Their mistakes, their successes, are all part of the rumors and scuttlebutt of the day. Cities are as complicated or as simple as you need them to be. You can even reduce a city down to a single location that the players will visit and enjoy. The 1950 film Cinderella, where Cinderella loads up in a carriage and goes straight to the castle, and that's it. We know there is likely manors and businesses along the way, but it's night, so it doesn't matter. We enjoy our ball and lose our slipper, and we head home. That's an entire kingdom she just visited, but we went to one location. In our Ghostbusters example, we have a quest hub, the Firehouse, for an extended stay campaign. But we don't have to do that either. There was another movie in 1984 where the city was the landscape, it was the wilderness. It had a personality, but we didn't stay in any constant locations. We moved through it like we would a dungeon. And that was Terminator. The city of Los Angeles is massive, sprawling, uncaring, and we go to a restaurant, a nightclub, the police station, a motel, and our climax takes place in a factory. There is very little human interaction outside of Kyle Reese and Sarah Connor and the police officers. The passers-by, in their LA personality, do not care about Sarah Connor's plight as she runs from the Terminator. Do we need a map of LA to understand this story? No. Because the people downtown are uncaring, we can assume the police station is centrally located, and a lot of our adventure takes place at night, when there aren't random passerbys. We slowly make our way out of town even, reducing the amount of random people we would run into. This is the city as a set piece, for a planned adventure. Cities are as complicated as you want them to be. But let's be real here. That's not the dream. The dream is giving your players a sprawling city that they can move about freely. They can decide which street to go down, which shop to visit, and which passerbys they wish to bother and interact with. The sandbox style of city requires information and planning. You are stockpiling information, so you have huge opportunities for improvisation. But for your first city, I still heavily suggest you keep it loose. Rather than naming every street and every building, making sure there's enough cobblers for the peasantry, focus on districts. Districts allow you to give a map of the city early to your players while leaving room to grow. You set up a merchant's district, just a shape on the map surrounded by other shapes like government districts and elven districts, guild districts, noble, poor, and rich. And into those districts you start sorting your locations. The nice tavern, the bad tavern, the shops, the king's castle, the adventuring guild. And now you start thinking about the individual feel of those districts, and it can be a little video game zone-ish. The industrial district is dirty, smog-covered, and loud. But the second you move into the nearby religious district, things change. It's calm, beautiful. How do the people change when you move from district to district? How do they maintain the overall feel of that city's people? Ghostbusters and Terminator were both released in 1984, yet the people of those cities are entirely different. And perhaps the greatest advantage of making a city in this district model is you can add things later. There is room in a world without every building labeled for player agency, for them to ask for particular shops, to say they want to take the sewers as a secret path to the warehouse. You can add the sewers. And frankly, because of all the random encounters and interactions, quest progression in cities is very, very slow. You may be in the city for what is in-game a short amount of time, but gameplay, meeting once a week, you might be there for a year, for months. Districts allow you to add new elements that you find interesting over that year. You want to make a heavily detailed warring factions, Assassin's Guild intrigue city because you just saw John Wick 3? Are you going to be as excited about that idea in 8 months? You may want to add things along the way for your own sanity as DM. And of course, as we've talked about here before on DM Gives Inspiration, there is a spectrum. The more time you have to give your game, the more detailed of a city you can do. Location-based quests work great for one-offs. Districts work great for casual campaigns. And intense city planning has its place with D&D as your primary hobby. But no matter what method you choose, every city benefits from more planning. More planning than you've ever had for a forest or a town. What makes your city different from the towns, from the outskirts, from other cities? How are the people different? What do they wear? What do they eat? What is the government style? Up to this point, you may have had a lot of chieftains or mayors. Ask yourself who is in charge here. And then ask yourself again who's really in charge here. Is there a king? But the church or the vizier has the power. Is there a king? But the king is the power. Does that mean he rules with an iron fist? Or are we just enjoying a bit of innocent fantasy, and the king is a good king, and he rules because he's a good king? Not all fantasy has to be HBO-ified. You're going to need a map, and you need to give the map to the players early, basically on arrival. Even better if the map you hand them matches a map that they were handed in-game. Make a prop of it. You're also going to need a calendar because people care about time, and cities are all about people. Shops open at certain times. Jobs are completed in certain numbers of days. You need to be ready to track time. The more trade your city sees, the more important time is. You're also going to need a big list of ready-to-use names. And that's an opportunity to flesh out your city as well. If you hit up a generic fantasy name generator, that's going to give your city one feel. But you go use a Harry Potter name generator or German name generator, that's going to affect those player interactions. And if you want to go a step deeper there, changing the generator based on district or using certain names in certain areas can completely change that interaction if the players can catch on. And pictures do a lot of the work for you. Cities are also about architecture, and describing buttresses and pillars for the 100th time is going to turn into mush in their ears. Handing out a picture of each location, either district or actual building, can set the tone immediately for what sort of situation the players are in. For my own cities, I like to add a couple of more things. I love having an area off limits. A rich district they cannot go in, a government shut down and inaccessible, a holy site or graveyard that people are not allowed in. What's more exciting than going where you're not supposed to go? I also like cooking up local heroes that are already well known throughout the city that the players can butt heads with. After all, cities are full of trouble. Why would our heroes appearing on the scene be the first heroes to save anybody? And I also track player reputation as a numbered scale. -10 to +10, what is the overall perception of the heroes by the public? There will be outliers, but in general, they move up and down in the city's reputation as a whole, and are reacted to differently depending on their deeds. And somewhere in the middle of this urban campaign, it's good to add a quest that takes them back outside of the city. For one, it's a nice break, but for two, it increases the theming of your city because you get to meet people who aren't city folk and hear their opinions of what the city's like. Paints a clear picture for where the players have embroiled themselves into. Now, as we wrap up this episode, you may have noticed that we haven't talked about trade, roads, waterways, how the city got there in the first place. That'll all be part of a future episode, Making Better City Maps. It is important to think about those things, have an opinion on them, but it's a very deep rabbit hole that you could spend a lot of time not getting ready for the actual game session this weekend. The main thing I would say right now is have an opinion of if your city was planned or if it grew naturally. A planned city with straight roads and circular walls is way different in feel than a meandering, naturally growing city that evolved with time. Was there an ancient city that your city is built on top of? Did one burn down and then they made a planned city out of that location? Those are things you can work on now. When it comes to waterways and if the wharf district is next to the trade district, don't concern yourself with that too much right now. Instead, focus on that feeling of a city and making sure your quest and story is still being told efficiently. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. You can find more episodes like this over at kylefergusson.com, 2 S's in Fergusson. You can support this show at patreon.com/KyleFergusson. Music was by Brian Griffith. I will see you all next week with a new topic for DM Gives Inspiration.